Today we're going to be talking, as was mentioned, about vue.js, and specifically some patterns that I found useful for managing vue.js apps as they get larger and larger. Vue.js is primarily a templating library, and so as your application grows, it's often useful to have a bit more structure in place. Vue's big claim to fame is that it's a system for reactive programming, which is a buzzword, and so let's unpack what that actually means. When I turned to Wikipedia for an authoritative definition of reactive programming, which is of course a good idea, I got a bunch of stuff about data streams and the propagation of change. I got a bunch of stuff about an inferred dependency with the associated execution model that facilitates the automatic propagation of change involved in data flow. Or in less academic terms, reactive programming is a lot like Microsoft Excel. It's programming where, when data changes, fields that observe that data also change. It's a pretty intuitive model for UI programming. A lot of people have paid money for Excel, non-programmers even. And so it's no surprise that a lot of the influential frameworks in front-end JavaScript, starting as early as Backbone, have focused on making web UI programming, if not fully reactive, more reactive. Following on what Justin said earlier, they're producing the illusion of reactive programming on top of the imperative model that JavaScript defaults to. And so while this talk is going to focus on ways of managing reactivity within Vue, a lot of the fundamentals should apply no matter what framework you're using, be it React or jQuery or some 5-day framework I don't know about yet. So let's look at some Vue. Just enough that if you're not familiar with the framework, you can understand what I'm going on about in the rest of the talk. It's pretty easy to learn the basics. I can go over them in 5 minutes. Here's a simple Vue component template. It displays pictures of a cat in a carousel. Now, before any of you notice this and start distrusting me, this code will keep on advancing photos infinitely. We will assume an infinite number of cat photos for demonstration purposes. Now, we can show templated text in Vue with mustache syntax. We can also bind JavaScript to attributes on HTML elements within our template. Finally, we can bind event handlers to events at the element level. This is where Vue turns into magic. Vue rewrites its data objects on initialization so that all of them have an implicit setter method that overrides the equals sign operator. When you modify their values using this setter, like we're modifying photo index here, it triggers a recalculation of any computed values that depend on this data. So all we need to do to change the photo displayed in the carousel is increment the photo index. The rest of the steps necessary for updating the HTML will happen automatically. Here's the JavaScript code that makes this component template go. Notice that there's not that much of it. Right now, most of the logic is in the template, which is fine for a lot of applications. All we're doing here is naming the component, passing the cat object into it as a property, and creating a data object to store the photo index. And a data object, if you've used other frameworks, is roughly equivalent to the component state in React, or to the scope object in Angular 1. So let's refactor a bit to learn a bit more about Vue's other features, getting all that stuff off the screen. One of Vue's cooler features is the ability to compute properties. A computed property on a component automatically watches its dependencies and is recomputed when and only when one of those dependencies changes. It expands the idea of reactive data structures that underlies Vue to include properties that are derived from that data. So here we're refactoring current photo from the template into a computed property so that we can give it a name. Vue also lets us declare methods on components. The important difference between methods and computed properties is that computed properties watch their dependency trees, and methods just execute. So methods are appropriate for things that change state or have side effects. And computed properties are useful for things that just want to track what something else is doing. Now, one of the things that you might be thinking if you've used other JavaScript frameworks is that this sounds suspiciously like two-way data binding. It sounds suspiciously like two-way data binding because it, in fact, is two-way data binding. You know what? That's okay. In recent years, it has become really popular to slam on two-way data binding. I think this is because, as a community, we've never quite recovered from our feelings about early Angular and early Ember. At that point, library authors didn't know what affordances we needed yet to manage two-way data binding in a way that wasn't kind of hell. At that point, we as a community didn't know what the traps were yet that were associated with two-way data binding. And so, of course, two-way data binding was kind of unpleasant to use in those days. But I think that we shouldn't let our collective fears from that period keep us from using the benefits that a reactive system can offer. The two big issues with naively implemented two-way data binding are that it doesn't always provide neat places to modify data, and it's displayed and updated. This is the $ problem, where you wind up awkwardly appending and stripping things from strings as users input and data. And two, and more importantly, changes can propagate across very large sections of your app in very unintuitive ways that are hard to trace. And so, as a community, we've kind of gone to Flux-style or Redux-style state managers as a way of correcting these issues. But it's important to remember that state managers only correct these issues if you use them thoughtfully. If you have a Redux logger log state changes to the console, that will only help you point to their source if you've named those state changes very thoughtfully in a way that actually helps point to the underlying state change. Ultimately, two-way data binding and global state management are both really big hammers. And getting on my soapbox for a second, I don't think you solve complicated bugs with a single big technical hammer. I think you solve them by having a big toolkit. I think you solve them by teamwork and by accepting other people's toolkits. Rant over for a bit. What we can take away from this is that for effective two-way data binding, you need to have a seam for inserting additional functionality. You also need a strategy for mitigating the observability flaws that are still real. You need something that will tell you where something bubbled up from. This can be really specific custom event names. This can be a global state manager, but you do need something. Out of the box, Vue gives us vuex, which no one really knows how to pronounce the name of, and which is a global state manager a la Flux or Redux. It's one that also aggressively leverages Vue's reactivity system. And so now I'm going to demo how we use it in a way that can complement rather than work against Vue's use of two-way data binding. Let's start by building a basic vuex store. We give it an initial application state with a goat named Buster who is kind of playful and very destructive. I used to live on a goat farm, and so I think that these are kind of the most important properties of goats. Mutations, like Redux or Flux actions, provide a constrained set of paths for mutating this data. And also, by that token, a place to insert observability logic. For example, you can choose to log all mutations to the console when they execute. So we're setting up this big reactive data structure, but we are constraining the ways in which you can modify its data. Let's try using it. Our goal here is to write backing JavaScript code for a Vue template that looks like this, that looks like a normal two-way data binding driven Vue template, in which we output a name and can set a name with an input event. But we want to also hook into the vuex store that we've constructed so we can use its guide rails. Getting the name in the template is pretty easy. We can just use good old computed properties and reference the state. But we don't just need to get the name's value here. We need to set it as well. For this, we can use computed getter setters, an incredibly cool feature that I only learned about when I stopped trying to write Vue like JSX free React. By default, computed properties only consist of a getter. But we can also define them as getter-setter pairs. This lets us leverage object-oriented principles around encapsulation and information hiding. Our templates don't need to care about the fact that we're referencing a store underneath, but we still get the power of a state manager. This also provides a really powerful way of thinking about container components if you're coming to Vue from React Landia or someplace similar. You can have child components push data up into the container and maintain their own encapsulation boundaries, rather than having the parent component or the container push handlers down into its children. That's great for some kinds of complexity, namely those that are driven by complicated multi-component widgets, or by the ways that widgets relate to each other. But what about complications in the data model itself? What about really complex derived properties? For these, we'll turn to a new feature, namely calculating the cuteness score of goats. Now, a friend of mine from back home had some criticisms of this algorithm for calculating the cuteness of a goat, which is based on both how playful it is and how destructive it isn't. But I used to live on a goat farm, and I do not find goat destructiveness cute anymore. Now, it's easy enough to plug this algorithm into a computed property on a Vue component. And it's also easy enough to have that property reference a particular goat in the vuex store. But what if we want to describe the cuteness of a goat elsewhere? We need to extract that to a utility function. We can put it in a different file, but util.goats or util/goats.js isn't necessarily the first place a new person in the code base is going to look. Maybe we can put it in the store. If we want to keep all the goat-related things in one place, we can use vuex store getters. Getters are like computed properties on the store as a whole, and are even implemented as computed properties under the hood. More on that later. But this strategy is kind of awkward. Getters have to talk about the entire store. Getters specifically cannot return functions. And so we can't efficiently compute the cutenesses of individual goats. If we want to compute cuteness in a getter, we need to compute the cuteness of all the goats and produce a data structure that looks kind of like this. Then we can reference individual goat cutenesses in the component. I find this super unintuitive to read. Also, it gets rid of the precise targeting that's so nice about Vue's reactive data structures. We need to recalculate all the goats if any code changes. So let's dive a little deeper to figure out our way out. Here's the dependency tree of the cuteness of any individual goat. We need to know what goat it is, how playful it is, and how destructive it is. If we're using a getter-based approach, then we add the cutenesses by goat intermediary to the dependency tree here. But how did the dependency tree look when we were using the utility function approach? It was a little more twinned. We combined the key with playfulness and destructiveness individually, and then used those to drive cuteness. This technically has more pieces, but each of the pieces is a little more understandable. We're optimizing here for humans rather than for math. If we want to formalize this, then we can use a functional programming concept called partial application. Here's partial application in its simplest form. You make a function that binds a specific argument to one of the arguments of another function. If we wanted to make a partial apply function, it might look kind of like this. But while this can be a convenient shortcut if you're using a lot of partial application, you don't need to do this. You don't need to install any of the many functional programming libraries on NPM to use partial application. Ultimately, you just need to make a function that adds 3 to y instead of adding any arbitrary x to y. Or, in our case, where we're going to kind of put a spin on partial application, we want to be able to take the name of a component property and apply the function, apply a utility function to that property's computed value in a way that returns another function that will become a computed property. We want to make a component apply function that applies cuteness to goat and returns a computed property function. This is a surprisingly simple function for all the words I used to describe it. It's really just this 3 lines of code. We open a new closure, grab a value from the Vue component object we've passed in using the supplied key, and then feed that argument into the supplied utility function. And now we've got this lovely little function that lets us stay in a relatively functional world. Not fully functional, we're still using delegation. But we're being a little less verbose about doing so than when we're referencing the store directly from our computed property. This is the template we wind up with when doing that. And you know this template works. But there's some things about it that I find kind of irritating. I find it kind of irritating because on line 3 we've got goat.name, but on line 4 we've got just cuteness, even though cuteness is also a property of goats. It's a little misleading. At this scale, my irritation is really mostly about aesthetics. At larger scales, though, this can become an issue when poor data encapsulation. With poor data encapsulation, it can make reactive data structures, or indeed the application as a whole, harder to deal with. If I see goat.cuteness in a template, then I can be pretty sure, as a programmer new to the application, that cuteness is a property of goats. No matter how large or weird the code base is, if something inexplicable happens to the goat.cuteness field, I know to start my search for what's going on with the goat-related code. If the cuteness method is just kind of hanging out in thin air, then I don't have that assurance. Which is, of course, why we invented object orientation. Now, the classic way of doing object-oriented JavaScript is to use constructors and make individual goat objects that describe the behavior of a particular goat. But when you try to plug these traditional JavaScript objects into Vue, we start running into some problems. Since we're using an entirely different initialization strategy for our data objects than Vue expects, we lose the reactivity guarantees that we can get with vanilla Vue. We're encapsulating logic, but at the expense of actually leveraging the framework features that make Vue cool in the first place. I was super frustrated by this issue for a really long time. It just didn't make sense to me that a framework that used object-oriented patterns so effectively in how it related its components to each other would make this really common pattern for object-oriented data structures so impossible. I figured there had to be a way around this, and when I found it, it was surprisingly simple. Admittedly, I found it by source diving in vuex, which was probably a bad idea. I was looking for like private APIs or something because I figured that if it could make its data tree reactive in a way that the Vue maintainers probably approved of, then there would be something that I could steal and use even if I didn't feel confident about putting it into production because of use of private APIs. After a while, I was really puzzled and more keeping on looking because it bothered me that vuex could do the thing and I didn't know how to do the thing. But then I found the actual answer, which is ridiculously simple and totally production-friendly. It turns out that vuex just makes a big old Vue component under the hood. A really stupid Vue component that doesn't have a template and that isn't mounted on the DOM anywhere. It just hangs out in memory and uses half of Vue's functionality to store reactive data. It's not using any private APIs or anything. The only thing fancy about this technique was learning how to look at Vue in this kind of sidewise hacker way, so that I could realize that I was allowed to use components like this. And so now we can rewrite our goat class as a template-free, unmounted Vue component, in which cuteness is just another computed property, one based on the goat's playfulness and destructiveness. Then we can use it just like we'd use any other fully reactive piece of data in Vue, and treat the goat's cuteness as just another property of the goat. But we are abandoning vuex with this strategy, and that makes me super sad. I like logging all my mutations to the console and using them as debug hints. I don't want to go like two-way data binding all the way. I want to use it where it's useful. We often frame object-oriented versus functional approaches as this very oppositional thing, like they can't possibly coexist. We often frame two-way data binding and use of state managers as these oppositional things that can't coexist. I think that's really sad. Both approaches offer useful lenses in each case. We have a powerful multi-paradigm language with JavaScript, and I want to be able to use all the lenses I can to break down any problem. To figure out how that applies here, let's look at the dependency trees again. The purely functional approach looks at a goat like this. And the object-oriented approach looks at a goat like this. These are not actually incredibly different approaches. In each case, we're still looking at objects as clumps within a larger reactive data tree, just as we're treating our application as a projection of the state of the data store at any given time. And so we can combine the vuex approach very nicely with the model approach by having our model components reference vuex. One quick gotcha here. In these cases, you do need to pass the store in specifically when you initialize a model. The component isn't hooking into the normal Vue component initialization process, and so the store won't automatically initialize. We can even use the partial application technique from earlier to make delegator functions and make the entire thing a little less verbose. Now, this is a heavyweight approach. This is not an approach that you want for smaller Vue applications. But when you do need a little more structure, when your application grows and you have the kinds of bugs that come from not having effective state management or not having derived state managed in a central location, then this, even though it's a little boilerplate, it can be a really useful technique for getting that under control. It gives you the observability and traceability of a global state manager and the easy code sharing and understandability of object-oriented approaches. I wanted to have some grand thoughts to end this on, but mostly the grand thought behind this talk is that we shouldn't feel an obligation to purity of technique. The thing I fell in love with in Vue is that while it has scaffolding and opinions, if you just want to code, it will get out of your way if you disagree with one of those opinions. It's important to me that we embrace the idea that we're here to make useful software, rather than have a lot of stress and anxiety about whether we're conforming to a paradigm correctly. This is me. I'm Betsy Haibel. I go by Betsy the Muffin on the Twitters, although if you go there for tech content, you might be sadly disappointed by the amount of feminism and cat photos and ranting about science fiction novels. On the other hand, some of you might think that's a sales pitch. I also, quick plug, recently founded a very boutique consultancy of 3 people, and if you want to hire us, then please talk to me.
One obvious question is, goat farm, question mark.
Yeah, I was born in Ohio and lived there until I was 4. My parents both taught at OSU, and my dad was both in the veterinary school there, and my dad was a large animal vet. And so we lived on a goat farm as kind of his hobby.
That's pretty amazing. Goats are really cool.
They are. They're really bad at playing tag. They're not really sure when they're not it anymore, and so they just kind of keep on chasing you.
So everyone, one more round of applause for Betsy.
Thank you.
Great job. And Betsy,